Picture this. A grown man in his prime, wearing the crown of England, sitting across from French diplomats as they negotiate the price of a 6-year-old girl. This wasn't some dark fairy tale or medieval folklore. This was 1396, and King Richard II of England was literally purchasing a child bride like livestock at market. The negotiations for Isabella of Valois weren't conducted in shadowy back rooms or whispered about in shame. They were formal diplomatic proceedings, complete with contracts, witnesses, and papal approval. Richard II, at 29 years old, was bargaining for a girl who still played with dolls and couldn't read. The French were asking for 800,000 francs as her dowry. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to fund an entire military campaign or build several castles. But the financial arrangements were just the beginning of this grotesque transaction. The marriage contract included specific clauses about when the consummation could take place. Not if, when. The document coldly stated that sexual relations would begin once Isabella reached the age of 12. Medieval lawyers were literally scheduling the rape of a child 6 years in advance, and everyone involved treated this as perfectly normal business practice. The French court had their own twisted logic for agreeing to this arrangement. King Charles VI of France was suffering from episodes of madness, and his advisors saw an opportunity to bind England permanently to French interests. What better way than to send a malleable child who could be shaped into the perfect political weapon? They weren't giving away a daughter. They were planting a spy who would spend years being molded by English influences before she was old enough to understand what had been done to her. Richard II's motivations were equally calculating and far more disturbing. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died childless, leaving him without an heir. But instead of choosing a mature woman who could immediately provide children, he deliberately selected a child. Royal advisors who dared question this decision were told that a young wife could be properly educated to serve English interests. The king wanted a bride he could control completely, and what could be more controllable than a 6-year-old who would know no other life than serving his whims? The Pope's approval came with conditions that revealed just how aware the Church was of the moral horror they were sanctioning. Special dispensations were required because of the extreme age difference and Isabella's inability to give informed consent. Yet instead of refusing to bless this union, the Vatican simply charged extra fees for the additional paperwork required to make child marriage legally binding in the eyes of God. But wait, it gets worse. The negotiation process revealed that this wasn't Richard's first choice for such an arrangement. He had initially attempted to secure an even younger bride, the 8-year-old daughter of the Duke of Milan. When those talks fell through due to political complications, he settled for Isabella, who was considered old enough at 6 because she could walk steadily and speak in complete sentences. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterclass in medieval hypocrisy and religious corruption. Westminster Abbey, one of Christianity's most sacred spaces, was transformed into the setting for what was essentially the legal trafficking of a child. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Arundel, performed the ceremony with full awareness that he was binding a grown man to a girl who still needed help getting dressed. Isabella arrived at the altar wearing a miniature crown that had to be specially made because adult regalia was too heavy for her small head. Her wedding dress was white silk embroidered with gold thread, designed to make her look like a living doll. Court records show that she had to be lifted up during parts of the ceremony because she was too short to reach the altar properly. Witnesses described her as looking around in confusion, occasionally waving at familiar faces in the crowd as if this were some elaborate game. The marriage vows themselves had to be modified for Isabella's participation. The traditional promises about forsaking all others and obeying her husband were recited by a court official standing behind her, who would whisper each line for her to repeat. But Isabella's pronunciation was so unclear that most guests couldn't understand what she was saying. The Archbishop had to repeat her responses louder, so the congregation could hear the binding promises being made by a child who didn't comprehend their meaning. The religious justification for this travesty came from carefully selected biblical passages about wives submitting to their husbands and children honoring their parents. Church officials conveniently ignored scriptural teachings about protecting the innocent and caring for the vulnerable. Instead, they focused on Old Testament marriages between older men and young wives, presenting this union as divinely ordained rather than politically motivated child abuse. During the ceremony, Richard II appeared uncomfortable with the spectacle he had created. Contemporary accounts describe him fidgeting during the service and barely looking at his child bride. When the time came to kiss Isabella to seal their union, he awkwardly patted her head instead, prompting nervous laughter from the assembled nobility. Even the king seemed to understand on some level that what he was doing was fundamentally wrong. The wedding feast that followed was equally bizarre. Isabella was seated at the high table next to her new husband, but she couldn't see over the edge without cushions being stacked beneath her. She picked at her food while Richard discussed political matters with other adults, occasionally glancing down at his tiny wife as if surprised to find her there. Court musicians performed traditional wedding songs about love and consummation, while a 6-year-old played with bread rolls at the head table. But the most disturbing aspect of the ceremony was the blessing of the marriage bed. This was a standard medieval tradition where the priest would bless the couple's bedroom to ensure fertility and happiness. Archbishop Arundel blessed a bed that would house a 29-year-old man and a 6-year-old girl, asking God to grant them many children together. The hypocrisy was staggering. Church officials were literally asking divine blessing on what they knew would eventually become child sexual abuse. Foreign dignitaries present at the wedding sent dispatches back to their home countries describing the English court as having lost all moral authority. The Venetian ambassador wrote that, "The English have traded their honor for political advantage, and their king has revealed himself to be a man of no conscience." Even by medieval standards, where child marriages among nobility were not uncommon, this union was considered extreme and disturbing. But wait, it gets worse. The wedding ceremony included a special ritual where Isabella was presented with a miniature scepter and ring, symbols of her new status as Queen of England. But these weren't just ceremonial objects. They were actual tools of governance that she would be expected to use. A 6-year-old was being given formal authority over English subjects, creating a situation where royal commands might come from someone who still believed in fairy tales and had temper tantrums when denied sweets. Life in the English royal court became a grotesque theatre of the absurd once Isabella took up residence as Richard's child bride. The palace staff had to create entirely new protocols for managing a 6-year-old queen, and the results were as disturbing as they were ridiculous. Isabella was assigned a team of tutors, whose job was to prepare her for her eventual role as Richard's wife in every sense of the word. These lessons began immediately after the wedding ceremony. Isabella was taught how to curtsy properly to her husband, how to serve him wine at meals, and how to sit quietly while he conducted royal business. But the most sinister aspect of her education involved preparing her for what the court euphemistically called her marital duties. Adult women were brought in to explain to a 6-year-old what would be expected of her when she reached 12. They used dolls and diagrams to teach her about sexual submission, describing it as her sacred obligation as a wife and queen. The child's daily schedule was regimented like a military operation. She woke at dawn for prayers, spent mornings learning to read and write, afternoons practicing royal etiquette, and evenings sitting beside Richard during court functions. But Isabella's attention span was that of a normal 6-year-old. She would fidget during long ceremonies, ask inappropriate questions during serious political discussions, and sometimes fall asleep during evening events. The court had to assign servants whose sole job was to keep the queen child awake and properly positioned during public appearances. Richard's treatment of his child bride revealed the full extent of his psychological instability. He would alternate between ignoring her completely and demanding her constant attention. During his darker moods, he would insist that Isabella sit beside his throne for hours while he ranted about his enemies and his divine right to rule. Court observers noted that he seemed to view her as a living trophy, proof of his power to bend other kingdoms to his will. He would show her off to visiting dignitaries like a prized possession, often asking them to comment on her beauty and potential as a future mother. But the most disturbing aspect of Isabella's education was how the court systematically destroyed her childhood innocence. Her toys were gradually replaced with age-appropriate items like miniature crowns, royal seals, and books about queenly duties. Her playmates were carefully selected children from noble families who had been instructed to treat her with formal respect rather than as a friend. Isabella was being transformed from a normal child into a political instrument, and everyone around her participated in this psychological manipulation. The French delegation that remained at court to monitor Isabella's welfare became increasingly alarmed by what they witnessed. Their reports back to King Charles VI described a child who was becoming withdrawn and anxious, showing signs of what we would now recognize as severe psychological stress. Isabella had developed nervous habits like pulling at her hair and biting her nails, behaviors that were strictly forbidden in royal protocol, but which she couldn't seem to control. Religious instruction became another tool for grooming Isabella into acceptance of her fate. Court chaplains taught her that obedience to her husband was divinely commanded, that questioning royal authority was sinful, and that her body belonged first to God, then to England, and finally to Richard. They used the story of the Virgin Mary to explain how young women were called by God to serve higher purposes, conveniently omitting the fact that Mary had been a willing participant in her divine calling. The psychological pressure on Isabella was enormous, but what made it truly horrific was how normalized it had become. Servants went about their daily routines of preparing a child for eventual sexual exploitation as if they were simply following any other royal protocol. The seamstresses who fitted Isabella for increasingly mature clothing, the dancing masters who taught her to move gracefully for her husband's pleasure, the language tutors who helped her practice sweet words to please Richard. All of them were complicit in preparing a child for abuse. But wait, it gets worse. The court began planning elaborate ceremonies to mark Isabella's progression toward womanhood. These weren't natural celebrations of growing up, but calculated events designed to psychologically prepare her for sexual submission. Plans were made for a special ceremony on her 9th birthday, where she would publicly pledge her devotion to Richard and receive instruction about her future role as mother to his heirs. The court was literally scheduling the psychological destruction of a child years in advance. While Isabella was being systematically groomed for her horrific future, Richard II was revealing himself to be far more than just a selfish king making a political marriage. His behavior toward his child bride and his increasing paranoia showed signs of genuine mental instability that made an already disturbing situation absolutely terrifying. Richard's obsession with Isabella went far beyond normal spousal affection or even political calculation. He began insisting that she accompany him everywhere, including to military strategy meetings and diplomatic negotiations where a child had no business being present. During these sessions, he would frequently stop conversations to ask Isabella meaningless questions or demand that she repeat back what she had heard, as if testing whether she was properly absorbing the lessons of power and control. The king's mood swings became increasingly violent and unpredictable. Servants reported that Richard would fly into rages if Isabella showed any sign of homesickness or mentioned her family in France. During one documented incident, he screamed at a 6-year-old child for crying after receiving a letter from her mother, telling her that she belonged to England now and that dwelling on her past life was treasonous. The psychological abuse was becoming as systematic as the grooming. Richard's paranoia began to focus specifically on protecting his investment in Isabella. He became convinced that foreign agents were trying to turn her against him or rescue her from English control. He ordered that all of Isabella's correspondence be read before she saw it, that her food be tasted for poison, and that her sleeping quarters be guarded around the clock. The king was treating his 6-year-old wife like a prisoner of war who might escape or be liberated at any moment. But the most disturbing aspect of Richard's mental decline was how he began to sexualize his relationship with Isabella years before she reached the age specified in their marriage contract. He would insist on personally supervising her baths, claiming that as her husband, he had the right to ensure she was being properly cared for. He began giving her gifts of adult jewelry and perfumes, items completely inappropriate for a child, but clearly intended to make her more appealing to him. Court observers noted that Richard would stare at Isabella with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. The king's treatment of Isabella also revealed his deep-seated need to humiliate and control. He would deliberately embarrass her in front of foreign diplomats by asking her to perform childish songs or dances, then mock her performance as inadequate for a queen. He seemed to take pleasure in reminding everyone that England's queen was a child who couldn't even tie her own shoes properly, as if this somehow demonstrated his superior power and sophistication. Richard's relationship with Isabella became a tool for terrorizing his own court. Nobles who displeased him would be forced to watch as he lavished attention on his child bride, knowing that their own daughters could be next if they fell from royal favor. The king's marriage had become a public demonstration of his willingness to exploit and corrupt innocents for political gain, a threat that hung over every family with young children. The international reaction to Richard's behavior was swift and damning. Pope Boniface IX, who had initially approved the marriage, began receiving reports from English clergymen about the king's increasingly inappropriate conduct toward Isabella. The Vatican started quietly investigating whether the marriage could be annulled on grounds of Richard's mental instability, but political considerations prevented them from taking immediate action. French spies at court sent increasingly alarming reports back to Charles VI describing Richard's psychological deterioration and its impact on Isabella. These reports spoke of a child who had begun showing signs of severe trauma, nightmares, loss of appetite, and episodes of uncontrollable crying. The girl who had arrived in England as a playful 6-year-old was being systematically broken down by a man whose grasp on reality was slipping away. But wait, it gets worse. Richard began making public statements about his plans for Isabella that revealed the full extent of his depravity. During court functions, he would openly discuss how he was preparing her to bear him strong sons, describing in inappropriate detail how her body would develop and when she would be ready to fulfill her destiny as his wife. These comments were made in front of foreign ambassadors, church officials, and Isabella herself, creating an atmosphere of horror that even medieval society found shocking. The king's mental decline accelerated as political pressures mounted against his rule, but instead of focusing on governing effectively, he became increasingly obsessed with Isabella as his personal property and proof of his divine authority to do whatever he pleased. By 1399, Richard II's reign had become so toxic that even his most loyal supporters began plotting against him. But what finally triggered the revolution wasn't his political failures or economic mismanagement. It was the growing revulsion over his treatment of Isabella and what it revealed about his complete moral collapse. The English nobility had reached a breaking point, watching their king psychologically torture a child in the name of royal authority. Henry Bolingbroke, who would become Henry IV, used Richard's marriage as a rallying cry for rebellion. In his secret meetings with disaffected nobles, Henry didn't focus on taxation or foreign policy. He spoke about the shame of watching England's queen reduced to a trembling child who flinched whenever her husband approached. The rebellion against Richard II became, in part, a rescue mission to save Isabella from further abuse. When Henry's forces finally cornered Richard at Flint Castle in Wales, the deposed king's first concern wasn't for his crown or his life. It was for maintaining control over Isabella. Richard demanded that she be brought to him immediately, claiming that as his wife, she belonged with him, regardless of political circumstances. His captors were horrified to discover that even facing certain death, Richard was still obsessing over his child bride like a man protecting his most valuable possession. The confrontation between Henry and Richard revealed the full extent of the former king's delusions. When Henry demanded Richard's abdication, the fallen monarch's response was to threaten Isabella's safety. He claimed that without his protection, she would be vulnerable to men with less noble intentions, apparently oblivious to the irony that he had spent 3 years systematically abusing her himself. Richard seemed genuinely convinced that he had been a loving husband to Isabella, despite overwhelming evidence of his psychological cruelty. Isabella's reaction to Richard's capture was perhaps the most damning evidence of what she had endured. Instead of showing concern for her husband's welfare or attempting to remain loyal to him, the now 9-year-old girl visibly relaxed for the first time in years. Court observers noted that she stopped her nervous habits almost immediately and began eating properly again once she was separated from Richard. The child's obvious relief at being freed from her husband was proof enough of the horrors she had experienced. Henry Bolingbroke faced an immediate diplomatic crisis over what to do with Isabella. She was still technically the Queen of England, but she was also a traumatized child who had been grievously wronged by the English crown. The French demanded her immediate return, threatening war if she wasn't restored to her family's care. But Isabella herself presented a problem. 3 years of psychological abuse had left her so damaged that she could barely function in normal social situations. The new king's advisors recommended keeping Isabella in England as a political hostage, but Henry rejected this plan after personally meeting with the girl. Contemporary accounts describe his shock at encountering a child who had been so thoroughly broken by her experiences that she could barely make eye contact with adults. Henry reportedly told his council that continuing to hold Isabella would make England complicit in Richard's crimes against her. But the most revealing aspect of Isabella's liberation was how little joy it brought her. The girl who should have been celebrating her freedom instead showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe trauma. She had been so conditioned to expect abuse that kindness from her rescuers initially terrified her. Isabella had been taught that her only value lay in serving her husband's desires, and without that horrific purpose, she seemed lost and confused about her identity. The process of preparing Isabella for her return to France revealed the full scope of the damage Richard had inflicted. French diplomats who came to collect her were shocked by the change in the child they had sent to England 3 years earlier. The playful 6-year-old had been replaced by a withdrawn, anxious girl who spoke in whispers and constantly sought permission before doing anything. Richard's education had successfully transformed a normal child into a broken shell of a human being. But wait, it gets worse. During the negotiations for Isabella's return, disturbing details emerged about Richard's plans for her that he had never been able to implement. Documents found in his private chambers revealed that he had been planning special ceremonies to mark Isabella's transition into full wifehood, complete with public bedding rituals and forced pregnancy attempts. The fallen king had been counting down the years until he could legally rape his child bride, treating her 12th birthday like a deadline for sexual gratification. Richard II's death in early 1400 was as pathetic and disgusting as his treatment of Isabella had been horrific. Imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, the former king, who had once commanded absolute power over a child bride, was reduced to a skeletal wreck who died alone in a freezing stone cell. But the circumstances of his death and what was discovered afterward revealed final truths about his depravity that shocked even his enemies. The official cause of Richard's death was listed as natural causes, but the condition of his body told a different story. When servants found his corpse, it was so emaciated that his captors were accused of deliberately starving him to death. Richard's body weighed less than a 12-year-old child, a grotesque irony considering his obsession with Isabella's physical development. The man who had spent years planning to abuse a little girl had wasted away to nothing more than skin stretched over bones. But the most disturbing discovery came when Henry IV ordered an inventory of Richard's personal possessions. Hidden in the former king's private chambers were detailed journals documenting his daily observations of Isabella's physical and emotional development. These writings revealed a man who had been methodically planning her sexual exploitation with the precision of a military campaign. Richard had recorded measurements of her height and weight, notes about her emotional responses to different situations, and calculations about when her body would be ready for pregnancy. The journals contained drawings that no sane adult should have made of a child. Richard had sketched Isabella in various poses and situations, often with detailed annotations about her progress toward womanhood. These weren't the casual observations of a guardian monitoring a child's development. They were the obsessive records of a predator studying his intended victim. The discovery of these materials confirmed everyone's worst suspicions about Richard's true intentions toward Isabella. Even more horrifying were the detailed plans Richard had made for Isabella's future training. The journals outlined specific techniques for breaking down her psychological resistance, methods for isolating her from potential allies, and strategies for convincing her that sexual submission was her religious duty. Richard had essentially written a manual for grooming and abusing a child, treating psychological manipulation as if it were a science to be perfected. When news of these discoveries reached France, King Charles VI reportedly flew into such a rage that he had to be physically restrained from declaring war on England. The French court had suspected that Isabella was being mistreated, but the evidence of Richard's systematic planning for her abuse went beyond their worst fears. The alliance between England and France, sealed by Isabella's marriage, was permanently shattered by the revelation of what that union had actually entailed. Isabella herself was never told about the journals or drawings found in Richard's chambers. By the time these materials were discovered, she had already been returned to France and was slowly beginning to recover from her ordeal. French physicians reported that she was gradually regaining some of her childhood innocence, but the damage to her psychological development was permanent. The girl who should have been learning to read and play with friends had instead been taught to fear adult men and submit to authority without question. The autopsy performed on Richard's corpse revealed the final indignity of his pathetic existence. His body showed signs of severe malnutrition, but more disturbing were the physical effects of his mental deterioration. His brain tissue appeared damaged, possibly from the stress of his final years, or from some underlying condition that had contributed to his psychological instability. The man who had claimed divine right to abuse a child had died with a diseased mind in a diseased body. Perhaps most telling was what happened to Richard's remains. While most English kings were buried with elaborate ceremonies and mourned by their subjects, Richard's corpse was hastily interred in an unmarked grave. No one wanted to be associated with honoring a man whose legacy was defined by his systematic abuse of a child. The king who had thought marriage to a 6-year-old would secure his dynasty instead became a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. The final irony of Richard II's story is that his death accomplished what his life never could. It finally freed Isabella from the nightmare he had created for her. But the price of that freedom was measured in years of stolen childhood, permanent psychological damage, and the destruction of whatever innocent trust a little girl should have had in the adults responsible for her care. Richard's grotesque end was fitting justice for a man who had used the sacred institution of marriage to legalize the abuse of a child, but no amount of suffering on his part could undo the horror he had inflicted on Isabella. The lesson of Richard II and Isabella isn't just about one medieval king's depravity. It's about how easily society can normalize and even celebrate the abuse of the powerless when it serves the interests of those in authority. A child was sacrificed on the altar of political convenience, and everyone involved found ways to justify their participation in her suffering until it was too late to prevent the damage.